for Architecture, Coffee, and Ink. Hello, this is Hollywood C, and you're listening to Architecture, Coffee, and Ink, a podcast dedicated to introducing concepts, detailing out designs, and tackling the architecture you might not realize the meaning behind. I'm your hostess, and I'm here today to start introducing you to the designs that make you wonder why. So I ask you to brew your coffee, grab your sketchbook and pen, and let's begin. This is so weird to be producing basically 3 episodes, mini shows, at the same time. I feel like I just got finished speaking with you all, my dear listeners, and here I am again. It's also weirdly impersonal because normally I have like a summary and a conversation with my listeners before the show, but since it's spring break, whoop whoop, I basically feel like I have either been working or sleeping and nothing in between. You know, doing spring break right. Of course, this is part of the multiple episode release that I spoke about last week, and the 3 episodes are coming out Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday this week. The episodes being released this week are the Panopticon Penitentiary, which is today, Killing Stones and Sulphur Springs tomorrow, and Cryptid Architecture on Thursday, because it's spring break and I have to do all the episodes, just all of them. Plus, cryptids and architecture, just add murder mysteries and Matthew Gray Gubler, and I am sold on that vacation package. But since it's spring break, I thought we all deserve a lion. So enjoy the episodes coming out at noon each day this week instead of 5 a.m. Before the show begins, I'm going to take a moment to focus on a more serious topic. I have no doubt my listeners have been following the news in the past few weeks and are aware of the fighting ongoing between the Ukraine and Russia. I will be sharing some information on ways to help with war relief efforts in the Red Cross and a few other sites. If you can feel called to donate and help, the information is currently on the Facebook page. And I know that for some of my listeners, podcasts are a way to escape the news and reality for a few hours. But please, at least send a kind thought, good karma, prayer, well wish to all those who are affected by what's going on. If you ever know of similar efforts or would like to share a cause that I am not aware of, please, always feel free to share them. But please remember that wars may be waged by governments, but the casualties are always people. This message is going to be released in several episodes that are coming out in the future. So please, if you're able, see what efforts you can assist with that are in your area. But let's get started talking about how the eyes in the dark might just actually be watching you in the Panopticon Penitentiary. First, talking through the concept and then moving into a case study in Cuba, a prison that was actually built to this design. The class I am GAing for actually talked about this topic, but I had already spent several weeks doing the research for this episode, so it was a great refresher right before recording, but I almost chickened out of posting this because I was low-key afraid the professor was going to think I stole the idea from him. But I digress. My dear listeners, please buckle in. I know in the past I've added trigger warnings to episodes, so I'm again going to add just a general one for this episode. We are going to cover prisons, torture, bodies, or rather one's man after death request. I would put this episode solidly in the mature audience range. Nothing graphic because that's just not my style here, but if death and incarceration bother you, please skip this episode. And as always, check your sources, check your facts, and more importantly, check me. The original concept came from a man named Jeremy Bentham. While there will be other names thrown around later in history, this man is where the concept became famous, but not necessarily where it started from. So Bentham was born in 1748 on February 15th and died June 6, 1832. He was a recipient of both a bachelor's and master's from the Queen's College, located in Oxford, England. Throughout his life, he championed multiple causes. I want to bring them up because this concept, more than any other that we have talked about, illustrates that good intentions does not necessarily mean good execution of concepts. And this is what a lot of individuals, even in the articles I was reading, struggled with this topic. The ability of the duality in humanity to be both a blessing and a curse in equal measures, often in same strides. Often, I feel like the weight of the human soul is defined by the rigor in which we both follow good intentions while carving away places to carry the burdens of our missteps. So, way back in the 17 and 1800s, he was advocating for things like economic freedom and equal rights for women, and abolishment of slavery, and the call for the persecution of the LGBTQ plus community to stop, just to translate it into today's terminology. There is, of course, always a gap when you translate, because I wasn't around in the 18th and the 19th century, despite the many rumors to the contrary. I mention that because, quite frankly, this project that we're going to be talking about today is a bit not good. During his career as a philosopher and social reformer in England, he created the idea of utilitarianism. So, if you are familiar with architectural history, or you listened to one of my earlier episodes where I super briefly mentioned it, utilitarianism is a concept where basically the ends justify the means, to put it in a brutal summary. Basically, the belief is that so long as the overwhelming majority is benefited, then whatever you have done, whatever task, building, etc., is justifiable. You are all smart cookies, and I have no doubt you can already see the problem in this concept. There are 3 tenets of this concept that basically boil down to 1, happiness is key. 2, the justifying of the validity of the action is dependent on said happiness. And 3, everyone has equal happiness value. There's nothing about morality or motivations included. Unfortunately, not everyone strives for the greater good. And under this ideology, you can imagine that multiple groups and movements throughout history could use this concept to justify their screwy code of ethics. In ethics class, you have undoubtedly discussed this concept through the train thought experiment, or at least I did in undergrad. The basic thought is, if there is a train coming down the tracks and cannot, for whatever reason, stop, sometimes the professor will say the brakes are broken, or it's being held hostage, whatever the scenario may be, and you are manning the switch to allow the train to switch tracks, do you let the train go down the current path and kill all the workers, or do you switch the tracks and kill the single civilian on the other track? Often, to make it more complicated, they will add that it's a baby or a group of animals, or they will keep the number of individuals per group the same, but change the age range in one group so that there's a dramatic difference. Sometimes the thought exercise will include scenarios like, if 2 people are drowning, who do you save, a woman or a serial killer? And then as soon as you pick, add on that the woman will eventually go on to produce Hitler, and does that change your outcome? My class left that day extremely somber, but these conversations are very circular because to answer them requires a certain level of understanding of the actual outcomes, which is very important for our concept. It is very different than the theoretical outcomes that Bentham predicted. One thing I remember from my notes is that in ethics, we framed it in regards to pain and happiness, with pain being negative and evil, for lack of a better phrase, whereas a lot of the articles and research I was reading was framing the agreement the way I surmised it above, where there are only happiness or the absence of happiness. Due to the limitations of a podcast, I'm using the simpler explanation. That doesn't mean the other one is less true. Okay, but back to Bentham. He was heavily implied to be a genius, with the most favorite fact of everyone to prove this is that he started reading Latin at an extremely young age, like the 3 to 4 range. During his life, his brother moved to Russia in what is now modern-day Belarus. His name was Sir Samuel Bentham and was actually a naval architect. He was the family extrovert to Jeremy's introvert, and he is actually the one who came up with the idea of placing a central observation building or person with the workers in a circle around. One article, and I can't find it anymore, of course, but will hopefully, by the time I finish updating the blog by Friday, said that he used to sit in a chair by the middle of the workers as he oversaw a lot of works and projects, and that's how the original idea came out. Since I can't find it at the moment, if I print a retraction next week, everyone knows why. One thing I think that was very sweet was that Jeremy actually did acknowledge this. While this fact might not come out a whole lot and is not as widely known, it wasn't due to one brother taking spite or credit over the other. But this idea of having a central watcher caused him to eventually propose the Panopticon Penitentiary. Unlike his brother, who is focused on the worker force and employing what we would call micromanaging today, but at the time was thought of as more of a centralized authority, Jeremy thought it could be used as a method of reformation by changing a couple of core concepts. His idea was that if you build a centralized watchtower that is kept dark, with prisoners all around, in individual isolated cells, unable to see anything or anyone else but the darkened watchtower, it would invite reform and penance within the individuals because they wouldn't know exactly who is watching them, whether it is their mothers or friends or high society. It's utilizing society as a disciplinary method, invoking self-reflection underneath the Quaker ideals. The Quaker ideals basically boil down to religious enlightenment is from one's inner self or through self-reflection. So what he is trying to do was create an environment to allow individuals to self-reflect. As we know now, isolating someone and preventing them from seeing anyone else, but believing that at any moment someone could be watching, is psychological torture. The thing is, while he had the drawings that you will see done by Wiley Reveley, who was an architect, Jeremy never built one himself, despite his lifelong efforts. But others did, which is why we now know how it affects others, which is what we're going to move into. So, while I'm going to focus on the one that is truest to his concept and has a beginning, middle, and end, several prisons in the world also followed the idea of solitary confinement. So, just in the United States, where we had a pretty strong Quaker influence. Oh, and just a quick explanation of Quakers. They started in the 1650s in England and were Protestant Christians, so that means that they were a sect of Christianity. There's actually several active Twitters for them, but they promoted peace and simplicity. How that translated into this concept was that it meant the cells were very simple, minimal. The thing is, they realized how much this affected people mentally and abandoned the concept once they did, because the goal wasn't to torture people. It was to reform and reintroduce them to society. But it came back as a design, and quite frankly, there are jails existing now that still use solitary confinement. Now, I'm not talking about the cases where it is for the individual's own good or due to health reasons. No, I'm talking about cases such as the one case from 1983, where the inmates were by themselves for 23 plus hours at a time. And this is why I think as a concept, it's so important to discuss and bring up, because history just keeps repeating itself. So for today's case study, we are going to talk about the Presido Modelo, which is currently open and available for tours. If you were ever in Chaton Nuevo, Cuba, and again, spoilers, this has already opened, operated, and been shut down, meaning that it is perfect to analyze under utilitarianism, because we can decide if the ends justify the means. So the Presido Modelo is actually on the Isles de los Juventos, which is currently constructed of a series of these circular buildings. It was modeled after another Panopticon in the US, and there were actually several more scattered around the world and since abandoned. In this complex, each building is set up as I described earlier, having cells with windows around the outer perimeter with a central, darkened watchtower. The watchtower looks like a lighthouse almost. Once you are in the cells, you can't see your neighbors, and the two views available are either out the window or the darkened tower. Altogether, there was a series of 5 of these structures, with 4 surrounding a central middle building. Built somewheres in the late 1920s. Unfortunately, it seems like the exact years changed depending upon sources, some as early as 1924, and some saying construction lasted until 1931. It was done under Geraldo Machado, who started out first as president and later became the dictator of Cuba. It was designed originally to be the one prisoner per cell, but due to the number of inmates, ended up sliding into the opposite issue. Being so overpacked and crowded, it caused sanitary problems. To put it bluntly, the prisoners were packed in with no provisions to accommodate for overcrowding. This caused the inmates to revolt and was eventually what caused the prison to shut down. Fighting, strikes, hunger strikes, etc. But before it did, it got a lot worse. Fidel Castro was actually imprisoned here during the 1950s. I think it was 1953 to 1955. And once he seized power, he turned the place he was imprisoned into the location where he would stash those who fought against him until the prison closed in 1967. And then the prisoners were transported to other locations on the mainland. I will warn for those who use online sources, I found that several used an excerpt from a book written in Spanish referring to the prisoner testimonies of someone on the Isle de Pinos. So the isle was actually originally called the Island of the Pines until it changed its name in 1978. So this is actually the same island, although there is another island somewhere else in the world with the same name as the original. I think it's in California, but don't quote me on that. So I am going to read a quote from the English translation of the prisoner's writing, describing how during the Bay of Pigs invasion, the prisoners had the grounds lined with TNT. I observed how several trucks loaded with boxes arrived towards the 4 circulars in which they confined us. The guards began to place those boxes in the tunnels of each of the circulars. They sawed the immense steel beams and at the same time drilled holes into the circular concrete massif that constituted the main base of each circular. They dug holes 10 inches deep and with 3 inches in diameter, where the tube-shaped packages 10 inches long by 3 inches in diameter were placed. The prisoner later goes on to describe them digging those holes, which is what I just talked about, and inserting them into the grounds. The current name of the isle is the Island of Youth, or is the Isle of Youth, and now has a school and museum in the remains of the building. You can visit it 24 hours a day and explore the tunnels. While haunted with the many ghosts that plague the site, a New York Times article included the following statement from some of the letters Fidel Castro wrote while he was imprisoned there. What a fantastic school this prison is. From here, I'm able to finish forging my visions of the world. Jeremy's body can currently be seen in the UCL, the University College of London, as he asked for his head to be preserved and his skeleton outfitted in his clothes. Due to deterioration and later theft of the head by a rival school, it was eventually replaced with the wax head. He wanted his body to be used as an, quote, icon. And at one point, there was a camera installed so you could see all those who visited to learn if those visiting would also be affected by being observed. But once again, a huge thank you to all my listeners. I will at some point update the blog by Friday. I mean, it won't be 3 weeks from now or anything that bad. I just meant that I have some job interviews and tasks that I will be trying to accomplish for when I return to school next week. Please rate and review. If you liked it, loved it, hated it, let me know. I love feedback and hearing from everyone, and more importantly, sparking conversations. I think everyone knows we have a Facebook page and group, which is just under the same name as the podcast. architectureinc.design.blog is the website, and everything will be linked in the show notes. You can always come hang out with me on Insta or Twitter. I'm always underneath either the Architecture Coffee ink page or my own. But now, later on, I will be posting 2 other episodes, The Cryptid Avenger and The Killing Stones and Sulphur Springs. I posted the release schedule for the episodes this week on Facebook. But as always, may your coffee mugs be full and your inkwells never run dry.